Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Nick Romeo. Nick is a journalist and author who has focused his writing on economics, policy, and culture. Currently, he's a writer for The New Yorker and has written pieces in outlets pretty much everywhere: The Atlantic, New York Times, New Republic, many places. And he is the author of the latest book, The Alternative: How to Build a Just Economy. It's a fantastic book, and I was really excited to talk with him about many of the pragmatic ways that we could try to find new solutions to things that, many times we complain about. So we talk about, reimagining capitalism, what that looks like, not to burn it all down and do away with it, but how can we make it better? As he starts in the book, and we talk about in the conversation, he talks about improving kind of how economics is taught in academia. We talk about true price, we talk about a living wage, what that is. We talk about the job guarantee program. We talk about the gig economy, purpose economy, how can we scale alternative economies, and many other topics. As I say in the conversation with him, one of the things I love about his book and really his work is, instead of being very critical and cynical, and there's a space for that for sure, and he does some of that, but it's really around the world in different economies, different programs, and he really does go around the world. What are some ways in which people are trying to actually do something different? What are some alternatives? And we talk about some of the things that have been talked about here, not necessarily enacted. I think the most popular one or common one people know is like UBI, and then there are other alternatives than just that. But something like that, forward thinking in a modern world. How do we try and make sure that we're able to really improve, our economy for everybody? And it's really fascinating stuff. And I think it's super pragmatic and super important. And Nick just does such a wonderful job. He's a fantastic writer and really tries to get at the heart of these things. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Convergent Dialogues at substack.com. Also on YouTube. So follow, subscribe, share with your friends. It's much appreciated. And now I bring you Nick Romeo. I am here with Nick Romeo. Nick, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk with you about your wonderful book. So big thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was it's very nice to have different people on about different things. It's I feel like sometimes I always get a little worried my podcast is too one way. So I do a lot of history, and sometimes I'm like, am I a history podcast now? And I'm not a historian. So and then I'll get like great books like yours and good research like you do, which is we could say economics, right? Economics is fair. We could say economics. Loosely?
Yeah. My background's in journalism. The book is on sort of economics and policy. So
yeah. We'll say that. Economics, policy. Yeah, it's great. It's so cool. I gotta say, I sometimes I read books and I kind of know what I'm getting into, either by the title or I've seen people talk about it or whatever. Or sometimes I might know the author. I didn't really know what I was getting into with yours, and I also love that because it's like it's all a surprise. I'm not saying this just because we're recording and you're in front of me virtually. I really like the book, and here's why. I'll tell you exactly why I like the book. I like the book because so many people kind of bitch and complain about the economy and wealth inequality. And well, this sucks, and this doesn't work, and this is shit, and oh my God, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, that's fair. Sure. There's a lot of that out there. But what's so nice, very clearly, very succinctly, is you give examples from all over the world, not just US-centric, of different programs in different places that have had a very pragmatic way of doing alternative ways of kind of economics or certain programs that have worked or maybe mixed results, but it's a good idea. And you just explain it so nicely. And, after reading it, I was like, yeah, why don't we hear more about this stuff? Why are we just hearing about people complaining all the time about how Yeah, about real issues, but there are people that are really smart that are trying to do really good things, and they have a bunch of different ways, different programs, different ideas, thinking outside the box. Why don't we hear more about that? And maybe we can change it or adjust it or scale it up more. And so I just think the book is really kind of invaluable in that way. So it's really really spectacular.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. Yeah, that what you said really precisely captures a lot of the motivation, which was to try to flip the script on the kind of typical doom narrative where, you know, you have a book and the first 8 chapters describe how horrible things are, and then the ninth gives a kind of,
Hmm.
cursory tour through some possible, generally pretty vague sketches of solutions. I try to do the opposite, where the bulk of the book is case studies of how to improve things. And it's not that there's no diagnosis of what's wrong. That's just kind of assumed because, as you said, that's pervasive. People know that there are problems with climate change that are linked to economics. There are problems with wealth inequality and kind of political stability that are linked to economics. But what's less clear is what we can do about it. And, this is maybe a different conversation, but the media is a big part of why the prevailing negative narrative saturates consciousness rather than sort of stories where you highlight an example of something that's working well and could be scaled. Those do exist. They're harder to get traction for, and this links to human psychology as well as
Hmm.
the economic structure of media and what gets assigned and what's rewarded in news organizations. But yeah, the book is trying to do exactly what you described. So it's really nice to
Yeah.
hear someone say that it does that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it just kind of hit me directly right from the beginning. And I'll just say on the point about media, I I agree. Um, but I think it's a lot of us, and I think it's just a lot of like, I put responsibility on both, of course, but I think as the audience, you decide what you consume, and if you're not consuming it, media is not going to write or talk or share or show any of that. They're really just kind of going to what the consumer is saying or doing, and so if we don't entertain it, well, then they say, well, that's not getting clicks, or the algorithm doesn't like it, so we'll move on to something else, and so in some ways, I agree. I think media has, a very bloated and overly extended influence on us, but I do think that we do have a little bit of ways of controlling that. But we're just pretty, short-sighted. I think we're very much like, instant gratification or the emotional piece, and so it's super hard to tell people, don't look at that video, don't look at that clip. It's, whatever. It's like everyone wants to look at that clip or whatever it is, and so I think it is hard, but I think it is possible. I'll say that on that bit. So, but
Yeah.
that's my optimism.
No, I hear you. I agree. Yeah.
So, okay. So the book is, The Alternative: How to Build a Just Economy. I guess before we get into it, just really quick, just tell folks what your background is academically, professionally, and what you currently do.
Yeah, sure. So, quick version of my background, um, I didn't study journalism, but I've worked as a journalism sort of practitioner for over a decade, and my academic background is actually more kind of on the philosophy side.
Mm,
Studied ancient Greek stuff,
nice.
and yeah, interested in ancient philosophy and modern philosophy, and that was actually part of the way I got into economics. Economics used to be sort of a branch of political philosophy. That's how people like Adam
Hmm.
Smith, but also John Maynard Keynes and many other economists would have thought of the subject. Within journalism, I've spent the last several years mostly with the New Yorker and mostly covering a kind of politics, economics beat. And, currently I teach part time at UC Berkeley. I'm at the Graduate School of Journalism here and am still doing a lot of reporting broadly on reimagining capitalism and thinking of new ways for the economy to be structured and function.
Mm. I guess just as a slight detour here. uh, I like that reimagining capitalism. Uh, why don't you do the like the thing that all young people do at some point is why aren't we doing like democratic socialism or whatever it is? Why you like capitalism of sorts, but maybe not crony capitalism. That's pretty terrible, or oligarchical kinds of nonsense. But yeah, it seems. How do you? I guess just generally. I mean, this is sort of what the book is doing. But why? I guess still capitalism. And why as a system, and how do you see it as reimagine it instead of burning it all down and just saying fuck it and let's just do some other thing or whatever. Why do you kind of think about reimagining capitalism that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I don't actually get too caught up on the labels. I think
Fair.
um, this sort of links back to the pragmatism that you were describing before, where if you want to get things done, sort of broad tent coalitions can be quite useful.
Sure.
It's interesting that people like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump agree on aspects of trade policy, for instance. If you got those folks in a room and you focused on the terminological distinction between democratic socialism and capitalism, you would not get much agreement. If you get into sort of case studies and policies, it gets easier to find common ground. It's a long-winded way of saying that I think sometimes as you go up on a scale of abstraction with nouns like freedom, capitalism, democracy, it gets harder to actually know what we're talking about. Whereas if you move downward on that scale, it gets a little easier sometimes to say, here's a case for nationalizing one industry but not another. There are maybe historical and contingent factors that vary by country. And so if you want to be a little bit more empirical and practical, you might sort of, instead of saying, I generally want all industries to be nationalized, or I generally want private markets to allocate resources in all domains, it's like a more nuanced approach, I think, tends to be a little bit more successful. That being said, I think people who want to reimagine capitalism in some sense, it's sort of like a heap problem, if you know that term from philosophy, where it's like when do a sufficient number of grains of sand constitute a heap? It's a little bit arbitrary. There are these thresholds, and so sure, if we reimagine capitalism beyond some level, is it reasonable to describe this as capitalism, or is the system so transformed that really it's functioning in a very different way? That's sort of an interesting, but also like a fairly theoretical conversation, which is a distinct thing from trying to actually identify the models that can improve core areas that most humans care about, right?
Mm-hmm. I guess the thing about that is for whatever reason, a nuanced broad tent coalition just it's not very sexy. It's just people don't go march in the street for, nuanced, balanced, moderate, blah, blah, blah. I know this because that's where I'm at. Right? I'm a moderate liberal. And so it's just like anytime I, kind of go on about why it's important to really get, interested in fixing gerrymandering districts. I mean, people just start, eyes glaze over like, oh gosh. But, if you talk about something that's, more colorful or something that kind of gets your emotional, wheels going. Yeah, people get more fired up about it. Let's talk about abortion. Let's talk about that. People are going to have no centered opinion on that or something. But it's like, I don't know. I think in a lot of ways, the most. I think this has been true typically, and maybe people get upset that I say this, but most progressives' ideas and how they want to do things happen through moderates. That's usually how that works. If you look at many of the things Biden's done, look at the things Obama did, you look at many of the progressive ideas, they usually have to get done through kind of a moderate coalition. And so maybe there's exceptions to that, but so all that to say, I agree with you. I think we do need what you're saying. And that's basically what your book is trying to do, is show all these various case examples. So you start with academia, right? Which I thought was interesting, and is basically how we teach economics. How do we not just see it as like this positive science? You talk about this this a project or program. It's called CORE, Better Alternative for Teaching Economics for Practical Use in the Real World. Yeah, I guess why did you start here with the book and looking at different alternatives, on the pedagogy of things, and then tell us about what this core is and what that stands for, and why we have a pragmatic, or why we should have a more pragmatic use of economics in the real world.
Sure. So, yeah, the decision to start with economic education in academia kind of is motivated by the sort of the thought that the Overton window, the set of conceivable ideas at a given time, um, is largely shaped within sort of economic policy by two things. One is this sort of slippage between social and natural science, where certain people, especially within neoclassical economics in the 20th century, wanted to present the field as a positive science, something more like physics or biology. The trouble with that is that it can justify a kind of smuggling operation whereby ethical and political claims that are quite controversial get dressed up, they get camouflaged as natural science claims. So I kind of briefly trace some of this history going back to the dawn of the discipline, like David Ricardo, the English economist in the early 1800s, opposes poverty relief to the poor with an analogy to the law of gravitation, right? So it's a clear example of what I'm describing, where he says, this would be as foolish as sort of opposing the law of gravitation, because if you give relief to the poor, they'll become dependent and they'll become more miserable. One can discuss his claims, but the thing I'm highlighting is the natural law analogy, which you can trace right through the history of the field. It happens in the antitrust era in America, where critics of increasing concentration of corporate power are dismissed with this same metaphor. A Yale professor invokes the law of gravitation again and says, this increasing concentration is just a natural law, the same way gravity is. It's all over, of course, in the media today, often used in very cynical ways to oppose everything from wage increases for working folks to ideas like employee ownership. So I'll give you one example of that second thing. The American economist Paul Samuelson, who wrote one of the best-selling econ textbooks in the 20th century, kind of introduced Keynesianism to America in the middle of the 20th century. He said two very interesting things. Near the end of the career, he says, I don't care who writes a nation's laws if I get to write its economics textbooks. So he was very aware of his role as a sort of legislator of cultural common sense through economics education. But in the 1970s, he was interviewed on national television on 60 Minutes, and the journalist asked for his thoughts on worker ownership, just sort of a newer concept at that time. What was new really was this model that became the ESOP, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan. At the time, it was called the Kelso Plan. This lawyer, Louis Kelso, developed it, motivated actually by some concerns that pretty precisely parallel Thomas Piketty's argument in Capital in the 21st Century. Basically, as technology advances, capital will get an increasing share of those productivity gains, so return on capital will exceed return in wage growth or increase in wage growth. So Kelso thought, look, what if we made owners out of all workers? So Paul Samuelson's on national TV discussing this idea. Host asks him, what are your thoughts on that? His answer has two parts that I think are relevant to this discussion. First, he says, well, sure, it would be nice also like if lollipops grew on trees. So notice again the natural law analogy. Giving workers capital is as impossible as sort of contravening the laws of plant biology. But in case you haven't gotten the point, he then follows up with this second line where he says, it has a kind of Marie Antoinette-ish ring to it. Let them have capital. Right? So he's invoking the specter of the French Revolution. If you give workers a share of capital ownership, implicitly, you'll have heads rolling in the streets. So you can see really clearly, like, economics education is this locus for control over our sense of what is possible. And I think smuggling in political claims under the guise of scientific inevitabilism is a really dubious thing. The core initiative, which you mentioned and which the chapter focuses on, is motivated in some sense by some of these same concerns. The project is very collaborative. There are economists from all around the world who have written chapters for CORE. They have a broad range of views and perspectives and sort of methodological allegiance. So it's not a kind of homogeneous set by any means, but I think it's fair to characterize CORE as a departure from a more kind of highly ideological neoclassical economics, which often abstracts away from empirical reality, how do markets actually function, how do institutions and market failures constrain some of the models that sort of suggest that efficiency and equilibria are general characteristics of the economy as opposed to somewhat theoretical abstractions. So core is, I would say, more empirical. It's motivated actually in part by listening to students who were struck by the fact in many surveys. They talked to young people around the world, and students kept saying, why are we studying economics and not learning about climate change and wealth inequality, which seem like obvious challenges in the 21st century, and yet economics is like bizarrely silent on these in a lot of our classes. So CORE tried to address that. It also brings on more examples from recent sort of developments, everything from game theory to behavioral econ. And it's also, I would sort of just conclude by saying it's in the spirit of a quote that I love from John Maynard Keynes, who says that the master economist has four elements. He or she must be in part mathematician, in part statesman, in part philosopher, and in part historian. So one way to think about what happens to economics in a lot of the 20th century is the mathematics part of those four elements really metastasizes and takes over. Math is super useful. Modeling is often very informative. If that's all you do, though, it's quite dangerous, and you lose sight of history, philosophy, and politics. CORE, I think, is a more balanced sort of distribution of those elements, and it kind of returns economics to maybe its origins in political economy a little bit more than some other traditions. I'll pause there. Yeah.
It's frustrating because I think that there's you see this in a lot of disciplines. You'll see it was a certain part of the second half of the 20th century where people kind of, I mean, psychology did this, sociology did this, economics has done this, on and on. A lot of the soft sciences has done that. Where it was like, in order to like kind of legitimize itself as a discipline compared with like math and physics and biology and whatever, it had to get very, very technical and very specific, right? Where it was like, okay, what's the quantitative components of this? Even philosophy did this, right? Philosophy had that turn to analytic philosophy.
Yes.
Which, again, I'm fine with Carnap and who are the other guys that were the big analytic guys, but it's not the tradition, I guess, of philosophy in ways that we know it and we see it in these big questions and big systems, and it's just very mathematical. And obviously, I'm putting my flag on the continental side. Obviously, I'm showing my cards here, but. Yeah, and so I think that economics has done that too, really leaned into the quantitative stuff, which is great. It's great to do, but it's not all of that, right? I think psychology did that. They had this big turn for behaviorism and empirical data, which is, again, great, necessary, needed. Sociology did that at one point. But it's really the kind of mixture of it. And so it sounds like that with the core program, it's trying to do all of that, looking at, I think there's a big push, nowadays for, I know economics has tried to do this for a kind of interdisciplinary approach, getting different people to kind of talk together at the table, not everyone kind of in their corners. But with this approach, this program, it sounds like it's really nice to hear kind of a diversity of ideas, different people, different, at different stages, things like that, really supplying new ways of doing things. So it's not just, maybe it's less gatekeeped, which I think is, not always a good thing. So sounds in that way very, very, very positive.
Yeah,
Um,
totally. Yeah.
I have there was one part, or I guess one chapter there that I really, really enjoyed, was this concept of true price, which I thought was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed reading this.
Yeah.
Tell us what that is. Tell us how it's helpful at looking at cost of goods. How does it have a human rights based approach? And what are some of the ways this can help us in understanding supply chain issues or inflation issues, which are more germane to today? I don't know if it was when you wrote the book, but and yeah, you give an example of Germany. I think uses this already, certain parts of Germany. So yeah, tell us all the details about this, and what are some of the positive things about true price.
Yeah. So I also found the true price reporting really interesting. True price, sometimes assimilated to a broader family of accounting techniques called true cost accounting. You'll see both terms used, but I'll stick with true price. There is a group in Amsterdam that has pioneered a lot of these methodologies, but it's also used throughout Europe. The US has gotten more interested. Some think tanks and academics are using true price. The basic intuition, I think, is pretty straightforward, which, if you think about a kind of Econ 101 example, you go into a grocery store, you pick up an apple, the production, so to speak, and transportation of that apple involved lots of people. There was some supply chain. Along that chain, certain costs of production and transport were externalized. That could be that people were underpaid. It could be that carbon was emitted into the atmosphere. It could be that some level of soil degradation or pollution from pesticides that will go into water systems and aquifer depletion. All of these are not visible to you when you walk into the grocery store and look at the apple. You just don't really have a way to know that. You do have some insight, right? If you look at an organic apple, there's a legally enforceable definition to organic. You can know that certain pesticides were not used. If you have a fair trade apple, again, there is some knowledge possessed from that label or discernible from that label. You can know something about the right to unionize of the workers, maybe even their wage levels, although that varies by country. But what you don't have is a kind of single comprehensive metric that says, here are all the externalities, and if those were internalized back into the price signal, here's how much more the apple would cost. So true price says, yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
So let me clarify a few things here.
Yeah.
So in your mind, I feel like for the consumer, the apple's a good example. When people go to, most people, I would not say everybody is this way, but when people go to a store, a market, a grocery store, or whatever, and they're going to buy an apple, they're usually, I would imagine, thinking about two things: price and quality. How much? Now, it might be nice to know many of these things, right? What, was the trade agreements, the types of labor, how it was processed, what's in it per se, all these things. But how much do people coming in care about that? Now, there's obviously going to be groups of people that care more about some of these things than other people. That's fine. But generally speaking, most people say, hey, if I'm going to go and get a bag of apples and it costs me $7, I'm just throwing it out there, $7 US, too much. Now, if it's $4.50, that's fine. Or whatever a person's price point is based on their budget, blah, blah, blah. That's usually the first thing. And of course, if an apple, is the size of a grapefruit, it's like, well, this thing is obviously not an apple. I mean, what's in this thing, right? Now, if the apple is the way it's supposed to be, about the size of a baseball, I guess, okay, then yeah, there's some piece there. But a lot of people do care about what's in their food. They don't want things with too much junk in it. They want kind of the real thing. I guess how much, my main question here is, knowing usually what people care about, quality and price, how much are people actually going to care, or would they learn to care maybe if they had many of the components of true price? So I cut you off. So you were going to
Yeah,
talk about what
yeah.
true price does, but just kind of with that in mind, what's the kind of, I guess, selling point of why people should know this, and what would that maybe change? So what is true price showing?
No, those are great questions. Maybe I can answer in two parts. One is like
Yeah, yeah,
a policy part, and the other is more a kind of human psychology part.
yeah,
So
yeah.
let's start with the policy part. I mean, I guess my general high level thought here, which is also I think what a lot of the true price stores, academics, nonprofits would argue, is that in our current system, when you buy something that is cheaper, um, it's not that those costs that are externalized are not going to be paid. They're just going to be paid by someone else, maybe far away in space or time, or by something else, maybe an ecosystem. Um, so
Can you say that differently, or say that another way? Like, how are they
yeah,
paid off in I know what you mean, but can you say it in a different way?
yes. So the cheapness of so many goods in a consumer society like ours is an illusion. It's not that they're actually cheap; it's that someone else is paying the cost, and that reflects policy
Hmm.
decisions. We've decided you can have underage workers in bad conditions growing
Mm,
this, and that's what
hmm,
makes this so cheap. Or we've decided,
mm,
decided is maybe a strong word, but we've allowed a
hmm,
regulatory apparatus to be captured such that there are carcinogens in your food, and you and
hmm.
your family are eating things that will slowly kill you.
Right.
And yes, you know, more power to you. 450, what a deal on the apples, but you know, the cost is not actually somehow as cheap as it seems to be. So I think a basic point here that True Price tries to clarify is that the cheapness is an illusion. It's not that sort
Yeah.
of the cost is not being paid. It's just that it will be paid in the future, or perhaps it will be paid by someone else. But the sort of the very idea of an externality, I think, is increasingly hard to maintain in a world like ours. I mean, climate is an obvious an example, but so are the sort of political effects of extreme inequality and mistreatment of workers, where, you know, again, to sort of sloganize it, there's a bumper sticker that you see in California, which is like, when you throw something away, what do you mean by away? Right? There's this sort of trick of the mind where it's like, oh, that's over
Yeah.
there. It's external. I don't care about that. As the world shrinks, as supply chains become more interconnected, it's a little harder to maintain. And so maybe if I can segue to the sort of psychological component that you were talking about, you
Hmm.
know, to make a more sort of philosophical argument here, you might think about making products even cheaper than they already are, right? I mean, what if we did roll back all sorts of protections, from the 40-hour work week to child labor laws to EPA protections? I mean, what if we actually could have the $4 bag of apples? What if we could get that price down to $1? Now, if the way that we did that was like actual enslavement of humans, or like actual poisons in the apple, like at some point, almost everyone is going to draw a line and say, no, no, that's sort of cheating, right? That's not actually the cost of the apple. You're selling an illusion, and you're doing so at an enormous cost to human health, societal flourishing, ecosystemic sustainability, etc. So
Sure.
if you can sort of accept that there is this line, people may draw it in different places, but there is such a line, then it becomes a little unclear why the current position of that line is defensible. And then I think you get into kind of empirical questions, which is you have to kind of go product by product. And it takes a lot of research and a lot of information gathering, which people at True Price, sort of both nonprofit people and academics, are trying to use digital and other tools to make this information available, not just to consumers. I think actually consumer facing true pricing is only one model, but as a tool
Mm,
for policymakers and business leaders, it's also a very powerful kind of heuristic that can help guide decisions. So to sort of to finish this thought, like um, it may not be the case that sort of the current positioning of this line where we say, look, prices are defensible given these conditions for labor and the environment. we may just be getting that wrong. And there's a lot of evidence that we actually are. And I think individual people, like if you chat with folks and you say like, you know, would you want to buy some, like a bar of chocolate is a good example. And actually in the chapter I get into this Dutch chocolate company, Tony's Chocolonely, which you can buy in America too. And they were founded by a former journalist who wanted to sort of show that you could run a successful business without having forced labor in your supply chains. So cocoa, a lot of it in the European and American market is grown in North Africa, a lot of underage labor in very dubious circumstances. He wanted to build a better model. Tony's uses true pricing to audit its entire supply chain. They don't pass that on in cost. One reason they can do this is they have a sort of foundation model where they're not as beholden to shareholders. In fact, 1% of all of their profits goes into this foundation that exists with the purpose of kind of helping guide development in a lot of the regions where they work. But, people like the idea of consuming things that do not entail huge amounts of human suffering, right? I think there's like a cognitive dissonance where you can find people who are willing to sort of say like, this is just how the world is. And it actually ties right back to our natural law conversation from the first chapter. You might just say like, that's just how economics functions. This is how the world is. Like, of course, I don't support slavery and I don't want to poison people, but like, that's how economics works. You can find people who are willing to go along with that. But if you start to give people better options, and if you start also just to look at history, where so many of the things that we now take for granted were once quite controversial, right? Whether that's environmental protections or workers' compensation, 40-hour work week, raising the minimum age for children to work, a lot of those things were once controversial. There's no reason necessarily to think we're at the end of history and that in another 30 to 50 years, like people could easily look back and say, well, yeah, you were buying cheap things, right? Whether it's smartphones or apples or chocolate, but it was not actually as cheap as you thought. And we've now sort of designed a social contract such that all of those externalized costs, like if you want to compete in markets, you can't just dump those costs onto the natural world or other humans. Like the current system, when you have something that's cheap, you're sort of incentivizing bad behavior. With true pricing, if an entire store had true pricing, when people pay, if people buy the cheaper object at a store with true pricing, and there is such a store in Amsterdam, and like you mentioned Germany as well, there were a lot of grocery stores in Germany that were sort of trialing it rather than actually implementing it. But let's think about a store in Amsterdam. If you have true prices at that store, suddenly when you buy the cheaper product, you're actually buying the product that is better for the world because the true price markups reflect the size of all of those externalities. So you shifted the incentives. You've actually reversed it, where cheapness is an accurate proxy for impact. Currently, we have the opposite.
Let me ask, just can you spell out a little bit what kind of goes into like true price versus the price we're normally used to, at least on the consumer value, like within a market? I totally agree with you. I think the incentive structure is a big issue.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a few people about that. Like if you change incentive structures, go a long way for changing a lot of other things. But maybe just what's that juxtaposition between like true price and like the regular price we see? Like what goes into it, like variable wise? Like what do you see, I guess?
Yeah. So one big challenge here, like you can imagine, is kind of standardization and comparability across different systems. So the store that I was referencing in Amsterdam, they have a fairly simple system, partly because they're one grocery store and it needed to be tractable to implement. So they'll have things like soil, water, transport, and they're working, I think, on worker compensation and conditions. So you can imagine 3 or 4 categories. They actually had color-coded labels on a product such that you look at the apple, you see, okay, the true price markup is $1. That means it costs $1 more than a non-true price apple. Of that dollar, 30 cents is going to carbon offsets, 20 cents to wages. And you can imagine a sort of spelled out breakdown of the true price premium. So if you're at that store, you either do or do not buy the more expensive apple. If you do, you're generating funds that can then be used to remediate some of those harms. If you do not, then none of that extra money gets into the coffers of the store. And it's important to notice that, like in this model, the store is the one doing the remediation, but they could partner with other organizations. And in fact, as it scales up, you're not really going to have probably individuals who own grocery stores like handling all of this money and like sending it out to particular farmers. It's going to quickly become an unmanageable problem. So you have to think about this, I think, more at the level of policy design and incentives than individual stores. It's like that's the easiest way to have a case study, but in my mind, maybe the most promising manifestation of true pricing is not as a consumer-facing tool. That can be effective sort of to raise consciousness, but if you want to actually pull levers of policy, you can imagine a much more rational system of subsidies and taxation such that costs that are currently externalized are internalized, and companies that can then succeed are rewarded for doing so, whereas the opposite are punished, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the conversation I had, this was with Christian Rohn. I'm saying this wrong. He does this work. Where is he at? I think he's originally from Sweden. Ooh, forgive me if I'm wrong on that. But he does this whole carbon accounting thing, and he's really big into understanding incentive structures. So if you want to fix many things with climate change, yes, you can, there's a lot of greenwashing out there, all that stuff. And yeah, you can put it on the consumer, but really you need to, with big businesses and or certain governments, change the incentive structures to say, okay, many of the things that you're saying, you need to change what the incentives are, tax credits or certain kinds of things that you get to then say, okay, this is how you make the big change. But let me go back to two things. So the true pricing is great. I don't dislike it, but my priors on this are super negative. They're so cynical, right?
Yeah.
On this. So if you were to, and I also think this is somewhat culturally based. So there's that. One thing here. My prior is, if you see somebody in a grocery store that sees the apple and they have the true price, or bag of apples or whatever, and they see the true price, some people will pay whatever the amount is if they can see this kind of hierarchy or this kind of itemized thing of, what the worker was, what soil, all the things you listed. My guess is that most people, it depends on the good, I guess, whatever you're selling. I think most people don't give a shit. That's my cynical attitude. For example, people can go on and on and on and on about Nike this, Nike that. Everyone still buys Nikes. People can go on and on and on about Apple this, Apple that. We all still buy the new iPhone. We all still buy the new MacBook. People do go on and on and on about Amazon this, Amazon that. But these very same people are the ones that are still getting their Amazon Prime every 2 days or whatever, packages sent to their door. I just feel like people, even the most righteous or zealous people will say, yeah. But then when it comes down to it, they're still going to do this. That's why I think your point is more important, is many people have made the idea of, well, that's how it is, or that's how a system is. And I think for me, the biggest thing is how things have scalability. So it's great for the case studies to say, like, we could do this, or here's how it works, or here's how it's practical. I think and I think you need a lot of that for, like you said, consciousness raising or other things. But the real like work, or the things that really change there, is where you can scale it, where you can say, okay, now we have whole industries doing it this way now, or you have whole uh, companies doing it this way, or things like that. That to me is the proof is in the pudding there, right? It's like, if we can do that on some things, then we can say, okay, but I don't know. I think the second thing here is also like the cultural piece of it, right? So I was just in Europe not that long ago, and I've been to Europe a handful of times. There's for me, that this is different for everybody, but for me, there is a comfort knowing that because the EU has some pretty strict laws on what you can put in food and what you cannot, I don't care how much I'm spending on it. If I know that the quality is good and that my health is going to be better than what I have here in the US, yeah, I'll pay the $8 for the bag of apples if it doesn't have a bunch of shit in it, right? I'm less likely to do that here, right? And so sometimes I think it depends. Many of the laws that are the case for in the EU wouldn't even fly in a House or Senate controlled. I mean, people were raising hell during the 2009, 10, well, I forget, 11, I don't remember, whatever that 111th Congress was, and that tail end of that year during the Obama administration, where they had a really big reform on a lot of the stuff that the FDA puts, how they label things, when they can take things off if they're spoiled off of, right? Because everything most of the time in a grossly capitalist society is, well, we're just going to lose money, or we're not going to make money, or we're going to lose money. So it's like, well, at what cost, right? So
Yeah.
I think in big scale, like you're saying, incentive structures, and then on policy end, that's where it needs to. And I think there's enough people that if you slowly change that, you can have that. And you gave good examples of that we've had for, clean water, or for air, or how we recycle, or, whatever these things that, 40 years ago people didn't do, and now it's just second nature. But that to me is sort of, I have my approach is kind of cynical, but then it's like, okay, incentives, big policy, scalability is where the piece of it is. So I know that's very long-winded, but what do you think about some of these things?
I couldn't agree more. And it's tricky with true price, because I mean, it's a kind of provocative and interesting concept, and so it's easy to focus on, like, let's zoom in on the grocery store and the apple. But in a way, I think that's a red herring to mix our food metaphors. We there's such sharp limits to the model of changing the world through virtuous consumerism, where if we just have better labels and more conscious consumers who will spend a little more per avocado,
I agree.
then we'll get to utopia. I mean, I share a lot of your cynicism. Like, a lot of people don't care. Regulation and policy are much more powerful tools. It's also just, it's not really like a reasonable expectation to have consumers at the grocery store like functioning as investigative journalists who are sorting through the conflicting truth claims and fact checking all of the products. I mean, it's an explosion of complexity when you walk through one aisle and try to process information with a lot of conflicting labeling schemes. You don't know how much you can trust. Many of them are industry funded. Like, there's an answer for these kinds of free rider problems, and it's regulation. It's having standard rules so that signals can be trusted, right? I mean, just one other thought, sort of, which goes a little beyond the scope of the chapter, but is pretty natural extension of the true price concept. Like, if you think about government spending money on things, right? That might be subsidizing a kind of sustainable agriculture. It might be spending money on transportation infrastructure. It's common to hear in these conversations, like, we can't afford that, right? If you have a broader conception of the full cost of doing or not doing something, suddenly things that might seem expensive, they could be very cheap If you look at
Mm-hmm.
the health of human populations, eating food that's full of sugar and processed corn, if you look
Right.
at carcinogenic effects from having many more cars on the road, like in the Bay
Mm-hmm.
Area where I live and where public transit is not great, um, things that seem expensive might be very cheap, and things that seem cheap are in fact very, very expensive. So this kind
Yeah.
of broad scope thinking, you can imagine it being quite powerful for budgetary and fiscal policy as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. I fully agree with you. I think a lot of these things, they're not hard to do. They're not expensive, but you get a lot of interest. And again, I put this, I mean, in the United States, at least, I do put this on people. Like these are the things for me. Again, I know they don't sound terribly exciting, but they have impacts. Like I feel like if people in the United States spent more time worried about this stuff than all the junk that we worry about that's not important. I mean, we could do this. Like we could do these things. We put the pressure on people, but there's not enough people that kind of feel it or know it, and it takes a lot. It takes a lot for people to do that, and I get it. People want to just live their lives and be happy, and they'll have to always worry about an issue. Like I get that, but um, yeah, I do think it is difficult. I mean, eh, I'll just, I mean, I guess it's somewhat controversial of sorts, but I mean, I don't really care. I mean, I'm not a big fan of tipping, and I know it's going to make me sound like an asshole and all that stuff, and that's fine. Like, I don't care, but I, the caveat here, I do tip if I go to a restaurant, right? But um, I don't like tipping, and it has nothing to do with the server or things like that, or waiter or waitress. I don't like the principle of it. I don't like that I'm spending a lot of money. Like things in the United States are expensive. Like they're not cheap, and they continue to go, and they don't really go back down. And I like I said, I was in Europe, and I went and I got I was with some friends and family, and I was at a pub, as you do. I was in England, and I said, let me get 3 pints, right? It's okay. And the lady rings me up. She says, that'll be £9, which is, $12, $13. It's like where I live, I couldn't get one beer that's under $15, $16 now. Right. And it's
Yeah.
like, that's ridiculous. This is the same thing. Like, like that's insane.
Yeah.
Right. And like, if you want to go and buy a round of drinks, like you need $50, $60. Like that's insane. That's
Yeah.
insane. And it's like and I'm not going to say it didn't used to be that way, the good old days, but like there's a problem with that. But I have this problem with like, with tipping, because it's like I'm not, as the consumer, going to spend a lot of money on something, which has some of that is driven by, how import, export, delivery, stocking, paying people, blah blah blah. I get that. And then on top of that, because the person decides to not take care of their workers, not pay them well, you're paying them $2.75 or whatever it is, and that their whole check and livelihood is dependent on me being quote unquote generous. And if I'm not, I'm, taboo. It's taboo and I'm the asshole. But even the way that works, right? Most people do it out of like social pressure or guilt. And we went from 10% to 12% to 15% to like, it's like 20% now. I have to tip 20% or I'm the asshole. That's crazy. Like, that's crazy to do.
Yeah.
And like, it's nothing against the workers. I feel for the workers. And that's usually why I do it, because it's like, this is how it is. I'm not going to be mean to somebody that's trying to just get by. But it does continue to incentivize companies to do it. And now it's not even in a restaurant. Like if I go to Starbucks or if I go to like a cafe, they turn that tablet around. It's like, do you want a tip? It's like, why? That's crazy. If I'm going to all these places, anytime I take an Uber, again, we'll talk about the gig economy. That's a whole other thing. It's like, okay, how many stars are you going to rate your ride? And I'm going to get 3 alerts that say, do you want a tip? And it's like, every single thing is that. And like, I just don't think it's the responsibility. I think it hurts economically for people on the consumer side to just, you're paying a lot and then you have to pay 20%. on top of what you just paid, that's preposterous. It's like, well, no one's going to buy anything. People don't have that much money. So
Yeah.
you talk about, in the next chapter, you talk about this living wage, which is why I'm bringing this up.
Yeah.
And you talk about the MIT living wage calculator and stuff. And, we all, Occupy Wall Street in 2011, and we all heard Bernie Sanders, whole thing. They need a livable wage, all these things, a human rate, all these things. We've heard that. I guess for you, what do you think about what is a living wage? How does that look like? These debates that have been very interesting in progressive places, especially of raising the minimum wage. There's mixed reviews on some of that. Talk, and you can throw in your ideas on tipping if you want, or disagree with my my cantankerous view of tipping or whatever. But what are your ideas on the living wage, minimum wage, tipping, all these things?
Yeah, no, I like the segue in, because I think you're right. Basically, I agree that if you try to outsource to consumers what ought to be the responsibility of employers, it makes workers very vulnerable. And you could imagine an even more extreme model where people just are not paid. Let's say they're like forced laborers, and then if they want to make any income, it's entirely up to consumers. And that would be, I think, objectionable for a number of reasons. But one of them, which I'll just mention briefly, you can sort of see from a study where in two states they had a sort of natural experiment, because one state eliminated what's called, I think, the sub-tipped minimum wage. What that means is basically you're allowed to pay below the minimum wage and then just count on tips to bring it up. The other state did not have that policy, and so the academics could sort of say what happens to workers in similar. It was a restaurant environment, similar restaurants with these different policies. And one thing that was quite striking was rates of sexual harassment, right?
Of course.
If I have to pay the rent, and like there's some asshole at table 3 who's sort of making weird comments every time I come back with the coffee, well, look, I've got to pay the rent. My income depends on not reporting this guy, right? I mean, I'm making this up, but like that was the finding. I'm making up the specific example. I'm not making up the actual study. The study found that if you secure the wages, reports cut almost in half of this kind of behavior. So it's very intuitive, right? If you give people, and maybe to sort of transition into what actually is a living wage, this was just about minimum wage or not. But living wage is a term that, is bandied about all the time, but it really gets popular in America in the early 20th century. People like Teddy Roosevelt, Samuel Gompers, and there was a Catholic priest, John Ryan, who sort of popularized the term in a book. The concept back then was close to what today we might just call like a middle class life. So it included things like some savings for retirement, some savings for education for your kids, some money to subsidize like trips, leisure, occasional nice activities. All of that was part of living. Now, fast forward a century, the conversation today is largely defined by one economist at MIT who runs this living wage calculator, which is funded in part by industry and corporations that then use the calculator to kind of justify their wage setting policies. And it's sort of gone backwards in 100 years. It doesn't have many of those elements. So people write to this economist all the time saying, look, I can't live on what you're calling a living wage. Why are you calling it a living wage? It's maybe more fair to describe it as like a not quite dying wage. It's better than the minimum wage, but people are still struggling to make rent, to pay for food, and there's not even a possibility for many folks of saving for retirement, going on a vacation, etc. So the effort to try to expand living wages so that they justify that descriptor, I think is a little bit tricky, partly because of the stranglehold of some sort of very dogmatic economists who used to argue, and some still do, that if you raise wages, you will increase unemployment. So this is sort of a natural conclusion from standard neoclassical economics. If something costs more, people buy less of it. Labor is just another commodity, so the same principle applies. Of course, the research has progressed well beyond that. Card and Kruger won a Nobel Prize for showing that effect is overstated, that when you raise wages, it actually does not have those unemployment impacts. There's a sort of possibly apocryphal anecdote that sometimes floats around where I think it was either Card or Kruger, one of these Nobel Prize winning economists, were presenting their research at the Brookings Institute, sort of showing all of this data that, look, actually, when wages go up, it doesn't have these unemployment effects that business is so worried about. And some economist raises his hand and says, but what about theory? Theory's data too, right? This ties back to the kind of unempirical nature of a lot of neoclassical economics that I was describing in the first chapter. So that being said, there's like a long hangover to some of these thoughts in public discourse. So you'll still see, otherwise respected publications kind of trotting out debunked economic theory, waving the specter of mass unemployment if we give workers more security and more wages. It's almost like the facts don't seem to matter to a lot of people.
It doesn't make sense because, again, we see other countries, especially in Western Europe, that don't do this and they're fine. Sure. It really matters on, again, and I don't have some idyllic notion of Europe. Western Europe has many issues. The EU has many issues. I have a lot of disagreements actually with how they do things, but I do think on some of these critical pieces, I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, 5, 6 years ago, I was in Iceland, and I was, just chatting up a waitress there at a restaurant. And look, without doubt, eating and driving and gas and all that is expensive in Iceland, even for someone that lives in close to a big city here in the U.S. It is expensive. But okay, so I was there and I asked the person, they were just talking about Iceland and just things like that, and she was nice and she was saying how how things were, and she told me I think at the time she was getting $24-$25 an hour, right? The equivalent for here for I forget what it was in Krona, but it was the equivalent of 24-25 an hour. That's unheard of for a waitress in the United States, right? And that they have a great, that they have free health insurance and education, and and things are kind of rent controlled, so it doesn't get too crazy. And and she was like, we have like a flat tax, it's like 10%, and I don't even really do my taxes, right? I just get like a 1 page at the end of the year. Here's what you made. Here's what we took. Blah blah blah, and that's it, and that's done. Now, granted, right? Again, Iceland is not some idyllic place. I mean, in some ways it is, right? It's beautiful, but it's one of these things where it's like, yeah, the country is basically a city that's got 380,000 people in Reykjavik, and that's about it, right? So, like, much different than a country of 330 million people. I understand, right? I'm not one of those people that's like, well, look how Norway does it. Look how Denmark does it. And they got 5 million people, right? I get it, but kind of like what this idea of living wage and places that try and find this way is, it does kind of like what you were saying. Things that seem difficult really aren't once you understand how to do things. And it really does become where we put our priorities and how we do things differently. It's not going to cause mass, economic downturn to just pay people in a service industry not $2.75 an hour. Like, that's fucking ridiculous.
No,
right? Like,
yeah.
especially
yes.
for how much food and that industry in the United States is so big. It's so big here in the United States. Like, it's massive. And it's like, I just totally just, don't buy that. And it really does feel like that's where people get mad. And it's like, it's elites, it's, big corporations, it's this, it's that, keeping things there, and people get upset about it. But it does feel like we know other places do this, other countries do this, other places can find a way, we could find a way. It just really becomes having the right kind of priorities that are set, incentive structures, things like that for, big companies or, restaurants or things like that to try and enact and start doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even on sort of economic grounds, just a few other points on the topic. One is that when
Yeah.
people make more money, they have more money to spend, right?
Of course. Yeah.
So that actually stimulates economic activity and growth and helps to create much more business and activity. And there's research supporting that view. There's also research on productivity and turnover, right? It turns out, not surprisingly, like when people are paid better, they quit less often and they're more motivated. And those same arguments apply to things like worker ownership, right? So treating workers well, of course, there are ethical and political arguments for doing it, but even if you want to sort of, in my view, falsely constrict economics to an entirely amoral zone, which is a little unreasonable, but even if you did, there's a lot of ammunition for this case just within economic arguments, narrowly conceived, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. So when I was reading the book, I was finishing it, you talk about this job guarantee program in Vienna, Austria. And I had just gone to Austria for the first time, loved it, love Austria. I was in Salzburg. I didn't get to Vienna, really wanted to go. But the country's great. I went around Salzburg and surrounding areas in the Alps there, and it was really, really nice. So it was a little bit fresh in my mind, just kind of like the people and some of the culture and stuff. Again, I haven't been to Vienna proper, but really interesting about, I've had this discussion with friends of mine that, every month in the US, we have, first Friday of the month, the job numbers, unemployment, 3.8%, or we created 200,000 jobs this month or whatever it is. And every month, I mean, we've been saying this stuff since, I think, definitely as far as I can remember, since the Obama years, where it's just like, yeah, but that doesn't get true unemployment, or doesn't talk about the people that dropped out, or the people that stopped applying, or the people that just have part-time jobs, or all these things. It's not the slam dunk you want it to be, and I just think we need new metrics. It's just, and how we report things, we just need new metrics. It's like that doesn't tell you. Maybe that worked in 1957, but like it just doesn't tell you anything anymore. And I think most people kind of get that. It's like, yeah, whatever. Like, yeah, we made new jobs, or yeah, the unemployment's 3.8%, but 4 of my friends haven't had jobs for 2 years. So what about that? It just doesn't capture that.
Yes.
And you'll see, at all administrations, Republican and Democrat here in the U.S., they'll just be like, oh, new jobs numbers. And like, I get it. You want to brag about it a little bit, but it doesn't really capture everything. What do we think about like this job guarantee program? You can talk about it a little bit, but I guess the thing that was sort of trending a bit was, this, universal basic income, and, how UBI could be, all these things, getting money, $1,000 every month, Andrew Yang put this forward and things like that. But somehow this is different, and in some ways better. You hear different things, right? You have different ideas, well, what about the oncoming automation storm and AI, and all these jobs are going to be phased out? Or, should we use some kind of just like a monthly, amount that you get every month, or, expanding all the social services that people want it? And I always find them incomplete. And so the job guarantee program was really interesting. I really liked that. So it just, you can just chat about it, but then where do you see or feel that it fills in the gaps that maybe some of these other alternatives like UBI or other things don't quite fill completely? How do you see it kind of juxtaposed with some of those other alternatives?
Sure, yeah. So it's a small town outside of Vienna, Austria, that's doing this experiment where folks that have been long-term unemployed are eligible, but not required, important distinction there, to join this job guarantee. And it serves a few functions. One of them is psychological. There's a lot of research showing the effects of unemployment can be really devastating. People get isolated, depressed. They don't have a clear sense of what to do all day. Like, it's not actually this sort of utopia where it's like free time, I'll just do what I want. No, people often get very depressed and want purpose, friends, time structure, a kind of meaningful thing to do every day. So
Absolutely.
Meaning is important, though. And the people in the job guarantee that I write about are sort of co-designers of their jobs. They work with social workers to try to identify what are some needs in the community, and then what are the skills that I have, and what is at the nexus of those two sets. Something that helps people, but that I'm also good at. So, you know, it's a very popular program. Everyone who was eligible actually chose to join, even though they could have continued to receive unemployment benefits. They opted to join the JG. I think this is sort of an interesting contrast to programs like UBI or guaranteed income in a few ways. One is the psychological piece that I touched on, where it does seem that sort of community, structure, work are deep sources of esteem and meaning for many people. You could argue that that just reflects some prior socialization and that, you know, that's not inherent to humans. But okay, given that that socialization exists, if it is even socialization, that seems like worth considering. Um, a second point is that there are all kinds of needs in the world that private markets are not particularly effective at satisfying. I'm thinking of things like care work, taking care of people, taking care of the environment, green transition work. It doesn't mean that the private markets have no role. In fact, you might try to crowd in a lot of private investment to those spaces, but using a program like a JG at a federal level gets quite interesting because you can imagine sort of simultaneously bringing a lot of unemployed people back into the workforce. And, you know, if you take unemployment risks from AI seriously, or even if you don't, there are a lot of people who, for whatever health or personal reason, are not going to be working conventional jobs, but still want to participate in society. So bringing more of those folks back into communities, into the workforce, into social interactions, while simultaneously satisfying basic unmet needs, whether it's green transition or care work. I think the conjunction of both of those things is the kind of the argument for a job guarantee.
I think obviously, maybe this would be, I guess sort of obvious, I guess, but is this idea that I just think about the psychological impact. I mean, kind of obvious, I guess, but I fully agree with that. I mean, I think, people get a lot of value and worth from working. I am very much opposed to people, like many people in the United States do, having their job or their career as their identity. I think that's gross. I think it's terrible. I think it's awful. But I do see when people are chronically unemployed or because of many things, bad circumstances, the economy, whatever, it has a really bad impact because you're too idle. You're not producing. And, not everyone's a creative. Not everyone's just going to be flourishing with creativity. They just do self-directed, right? So, some people are, which is great. But I think at the very least, everyone's different, right? And a job provides some structure for people to give something, to of sorts create, to feel, of a sort purposeful.
Yeah.
And I think we need those things. I think we need those things, and maybe some of it's to be rich and famous, but maybe some of it's just to make an impact, or because they feel passionate about it, or whatever it is, or because they enjoy it, and I think that I like a lot of the things that Job Guarantee Program has more than maybe some of the other alternative things that people have said or whatever. So I find that very important. Okay, so I mentioned it earlier, so we can talk about this for just a little bit. Oh man, a lot to say here, but yeah, this whole gig economy is it started out as a really good idea, I think, and when it came online of sorts of doing things, DoorDash, Lyft, Uber, even, Amazon workers, whatever. I mean, granted, they're hired by Amazon, but, there's some crossover. But now we know super, super negative effects. It's very demanding. Maybe you can spell out a little bit some of the pretty negative things about those things, and what it would look like, or what it could take to have or to see it. You say it in the book, a gig economy as a kind of public utility, right? Kind of I thought that was a really interesting concept. We talk about public utility, like my water bill, or my electric bill, or whatever it is. What if something that we're using all the time, or increasingly so, could be more like something like that. So yeah, maybe just talk about some of the issues. Some people don't know that. They just see their Uber driver and like, oh, there's a side hustle for them. Good for them, whatever. But people don't know a lot of the negative things about it. And then yeah, how maybe some of that could be conceptualized or reconceptualized as a public utility.
Yeah, so on the negative sides of gig work, there's a lot of research and reporting on this, but kind of in a nutshell, you have um, fairly predatory private companies, often backed by venture capital. So they're not even necessarily the ones pulling the levers, they're just trying to get return to investors. And so what that looks like is they have to extract a greater and greater percentage of every transaction. So when your Uber driver is complaining, which they often do, understandably, about like, of the $60 you just paid, I'll only get 25, or whatever the figures are. They're whatever the specifics are, they're often it's very opaque to the drivers where the money is going. They have very little power to shape their working conditions, and they're getting a very small cut of every transaction because a lot of the money is flowing away to shareholders. So the public utility model is a compelling alternative for a few reasons, or at least that's the argument in this chapter of the book. And the people working on this are starting to trial it at municipal levels. There's a British policy guy named Wingham Rowan, who's kind of the star of this chapter that I spent a lot of time with, and so his argument is that if you had digital markets that functioned as public utilities, you could bring together buyers and sellers of all kinds of things. Could be rides, could be food, could be part-time work, could be high skill work, could be lower skill work, but you could aggregate all of that onto one platform, and then it would sort of function in order to create value for the public rather than create return on investment for shareholders. And so rather than 30 to 50% cut per transaction, you might see 3 to 5%. This would make prices lower for consumers. It would make wages higher for workers. You could also pretty naturally start to do things like have portable pension, portable benefit, wage and hour protection, unionization rights. All of that becomes a lot easier when it's sort of conceptualized as a public good rather than workers who are siloed. Maybe they drive for two different ride sharing apps, and they deliver food for a third. And there's no sort of common identity that floats across that. They have a new profile for each. The final thought maybe is that you could start to give folks meaningful progression up a career ladder, such that rather than the kind of the current incentive is for gig companies to keep people in those jobs, not to say, let's train you and upskill you so that in a year you're a home health aide if that's what you want to do, rather than delivering this. On the contrary, if it's in the public interest, like you want to listen to what workers want and then sort of connect them to opportunities, such that if there's a shortage of school aides in your district and you're on this public utility, maybe you get an alert saying, hey, after you're done driving or whatever gig you're doing today, come to this after school drop-in session and like meet some of the people who are going to be hiring next fall in the school district. Right? Uber's not really pinging workers with those kinds of opportunities. So there are a lot of kind of interesting possibilities that come online when you start to think in this way.
I think it's interesting. It's people. I don't know. To me, it sounds fine. And look, maybe it doesn't work, right? But I think you have to try different things. And people complain, but then they're resistant when you give options. It's like, well, like, well, then you think of something then, right? Like, like I can see maybe some holes in that or whatever. But I think generally that sounds like a good thing to try. I think that's something that I have this general idea that a lot of the times things start out some way and you don't know how it's going to spawn out and how it's going to grow and how much bigger it's going to become. So then you have to reconceptualize it differently. I mean, this is different, but just as an example, I think the thing that needs to happen, I just don't know how. I just think it's a novel problem that just evolved. Is there are companies like Meta, Google, Apple, Amazon that function. Yes, they're technically private companies, but they don't function that way. Their reach is crazy. They need regulation like you would for a state government. And I know that makes people, it's like, oh, you've been talking to too many Marxists or something, like, right? But it's a novel problem. Like, Jeff Bezos didn't think Amazon was going to be this big. I don't think Steve Jobs thought. I mean, it wasn't that big. Apple wasn't that big. Not even until the early 2000s, it wasn't that big. So it's just, as it becomes bigger and it has global reach, you need to have different sets of rules and different ways of conceptualizing it. It's not just a private company, or at the very least, there's a tier system. There's like massively big private companies that need a set of rules or regulations or whatever. And then there's, another mid tier and then whatever bottom tier. And I think in the same way, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, whatever, it starts out a certain way, but now it's become so, like, we don't have taxis anymore, basically. I mean, we do, but like, we have Uber, we have Lyft. I mean, I use it. I mean, most people use it. It's just so embedded in how we do things. You have to reconceptualize things. You have to create newer standards, regulations. Like, that's just how the world is. Things grow, they evolve. You can't only just see it as, one way. I think this is sort of not that dissimilar to the discussion we were having about, the food industry and people that are in that industry and doing things. You just have to find new ways. And I think for a variety of reasons, not doing that just compounds the problems even more. And that's why I really like a lot of the things you're sharing in the book. Is it's like, well, here's examples of where people are trying. They're trying to find a different way. Here's an example. Here's a case study of this project or how they're trying to do things, which I think is super important. I guess the one question I have here is what are some of the difficulties or limits of getting that to scale, right? How is that so? Where does the breakdown in that, do you think, of scalability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and the challenge is hardly trivial. You already touched on one of those obstacles, which is just the entrenched market power of some of the major gig companies. I mean, they spend enormous amounts of money trying to shape regulation, trying to break into new markets, trying to eviscerate worker protections. So to think that they would not react to a model like this is quite naive. Of course they would. They would spend their war chests freely. It's also, I think, challenging to get enough sort of initial both buyer and seller of labor onto one platform so that you have an economy of scale and sufficient volume of transaction that it's useful, right? I mean, it's quite convenient to get an Uber or Lyft because there are a lot of drivers out there and a lot of people use the service. And so when network effects are sort of a precondition for use, it gets tricky because then entrenched actors have a very, very considerable advantage. So I think that would be another challenge, is like getting from the small scale to the intermediate and then the intermediate to the big. That would all have to happen very quickly, or else people would just start to feel like, why should I use the public option for for gig work, whether I'm a buyer or a seller of part-time work. Why should I use the public option if it's slower, clunkier? I can't really count on finding someone to do yard work or to deliver food or even to do like architectural drafts for my remodel, whatever the work is. You have to have enough people buying and selling labor that it really functions, right?
Yeah, I think it's the question, right? That's how we scale things, how we change incentive structures, I think is the question. So, I guess one of the last things here, I mean, there's many other topics we could get into that are in the book, but I guess one of the last ones I wanted to ask about is you talk about perpetual purpose trusts, right? And what a purpose economy looks like and how that could help small business. You talk about the Mint model. So maybe just tell us about that, the Mint model, and why, a lot of the times people become very, whether it's true or not, but I think there's some good faith actors there that people uh, care about small businesses, and there's a lot of people out there. And so talk about this kind of purpose economy, how it could help small businesses, and the Mint model, and some of the lessons there.
Yeah, so the perpetual purpose trust is a new corporate ownership structure. It's in some sense it's an old sort of it's an old structure with a new name. Another name for it is just an employee ownership trust. But the idea is that if you're a retiring business owner and you would like the values that animated your business to continue, it's risky to just sell your company, right? You could sell to private equity, you could sell to a strategic buyer. There's no guarantee that those new owners will continue the company. They might sort of strip it of assets, they might sell it, they might close it, who knows? The perpetual purpose trust allows business owners to transfer ownership of the company to an actual legal trust, hence the trust word, and then to stipulate a purpose within the trust. And that sort of purpose can be very flexible. I mean, it could be all sorts of things. We saw this with a very large company recently with the Patagonia transition to a perpetual purpose trust made the news a few years ago. But I cover this in the book with companies at a range of sizes, range of different industries and sectors. All of the folks doing it, though, sort of face this common problem of ensuring the longevity of values after they step away. And the purpose trust is a sort of mechanism for doing that, where let's say I care about sharing some profits with my workers or donating some of my profits annually to a nonprofit environmental group. If I want that to happen for the next 50 years, long after I'm gone, not just from the business, but from the earth, here's a legal document that says, as long as this company exists, this will happen. Then there's a trustee. The trustee has a fiduciary duty to oversee that. There's often a board. The board might include an employee, it might include the CEO, it might include other folks from the community, maybe someone from that nonprofit who's getting an annual donation. So all of this makes it just much harder to kind of continue the private equity model where businesses are acquired, assets and values are kind of stripped away or consolidated, and profit is maximized at all costs. It's a sort of, at least in the examples I talk about in the book, it's a way of pushing back on profit maximization as like the defining point of a business. It's like, yes, profits are useful, but they're often useful in order to further some other end or goal. The Mint model is just another application of purpose trust. It stands for Mixed Income Neighborhood Trust, and it sort of deploys a purpose trust in the real estate sector where basically you have a portfolio of real estate assets and there's a cross subsidy within the portfolio. So some percentage of it will be at market rates, and then some percentage will be capped at affordable rates. And the purpose trust can stipulate the details of how that arrangement works. So you could say, we're always going to have 70% of units in this trust affordable. We're going to have sort of voice and representation for folks in the neighborhood. So residents will be on the board. They'll get to make decisions about how the trust functions, new acquisitions, community issues, etc. So it's a versatile tool. It can apply to private businesses. It can apply to sort of the affordable housing and real estate space. It's a sort of interesting new legal. It's a sort of hack that uses a legal device for an economic purpose.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things of saying, like, how could you do something not just for profit, but for many other uses as well. And I think, again, I think it's a hard thing for people to kind of reconceptualize in some ways. The last question here is, you give so many examples from all over the world: Germany, Austria. I think you mentioned Holland. We didn't talk about the example in Spain and Basque Country, which is really cool. All these examples around the world about these better alternative economies and ways in which they're trying to do things differently and in very, not some ideologically obsessed way, but in a very pragmatic way of trying to, there's a problem, how do we think outside the box and have a good solution? And I guess the question is why don't we hear enough about these alternatives, kind of mentioned at the beginning, and how can we continue to foster and boost those who are creative and groundbreaking with alternative economies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, maybe just because of availability bias, I'm kind of inclined to blame journalists because I spend too much time around editors and journalists who are often very kind of, to be fair, they face a lot of constraints. The business is sort of still in search of a viable business model, journalism. And so they're often, like we were saying at the beginning, they're incentivized to assign stories that get lots of clicks rather than stories that go into depth on important issues and that highlight sort of compelling ideas and models. And so it's hard to overstate how heavily that shapes what shows up in the news. It's an enormous force. That being said, I'm aware that my vantage within that industry may sort of incline me to overweight that factor in explaining this. And, I think one could point to many other things, whether it's regulatory capture by corporations, whether it's the increasing sort of addictive qualities and polarizing qualities of social media. There are lots of things that prevent both individuals and governments from thinking pragmatically and practically about how to improve pressing problems. I mean, it's much easier to sort of pick fights with people, pick fights with other politicians. You get more coverage, you get more followers. It's hard to get into the details and figure out, like, well, how does SEC regulation affect share prices and affect worker conditions? What does the NLRB actually do, and why should I care? These are hard things to get people to sort of buy into, and yet many of the things that many people care about most are defined by very wonky, detail-heavy legal and economic and technical domains. And so I think we ignore them at our own peril. I mean, it's not a great answer. I'm copping out a little bit because I don't have a sort of clear, like, here are the 3 steps to follow, and then we'll all have a better economy. I wish I did, but
no. I don't want that answer. I usually don't like those answers either. Anyways, no, but I did think it's right. I think it's important to point to this idea of looking or searching for, or taking the time to read those articles or watch those programs or listen to those conversations that are productive and positive, and avoid just the eternal hellscape of, oh my God, everything's crumbling. And it's like, yeah, that's easy. That's easy to just kind of, it's like junk food for our mind. But, and again, that's not to say that there aren't problems and there aren't serious. I'm not saying that, but you look at that enough and it's like, okay, but now how do I actually find things that are going on in the world that people are producing and they're productive? And I think we need more of that. And I think not only does it make us have a more positive outlook in a realistic way, but it also can kind of spur people on to say, okay, like, yeah, there's some really good stuff happening, things that are really going on, which is what we need. Well, Nick, this was a lot of fun. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. Just to really get into some of the details about some of the examples you give. I still really like the bit on true price. I loved reading about it. I loved talking to you about it. That was really, really interesting. Again, all of it was great. Big thanks for coming on and talking about this and for giving us all of your wonderful insights. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. A pleasure to talk.
Yes, of course.